So I just want to briefly touch on some stuff I was reading in this article here. Let's see here. Yeah, 4 ways of making HTTPS requests with Node.js. And I just read, skimmed and read a bit here to get to the stuff. Yeah, this is the stuff that's interesting. So he's showing first and foremost the old school way of doing a HTTP request in Node, and I completely agree. This is like that this first iteration is not that great. I mean, as he goes through like the cons, a bit verbose, the response is a stream, no support for promises. Yeah, and these are issues that I absolutely agree with. They're not that great. You can actually in the more recent releases wrap things and get promises from this, but it's not that great. And as you say, it's a stream. And for the like streams are great if that's your need, but I'm gonna be honest and say I don't really see, like, for the most part people are communicating using either JSON or XML over the wire, and you don't really need a stream to, like, unless you have a really big file you're getting, or like the data is really big. Usually you get it into a buffer and like you read it just as is. So I agree on this one. The first one isn't that nice. And then he has something called the request module, which is that's why I was kind of surprised. Oh, 4 ways of getting stuff from the HTTP. I was like, I know one, because as far as I know, there's only one way to do that, or two if the other one, like the first one being the native way, and the other one being you get a third-party library, and apparently to him, the three other ways of the four that he's talking about is just three different libraries. So that to me is a little bit weird because there's only two as far as I know. But anywho, yeah, so this is one of the I've never used request, but the syntax looks pretty straightforward. And now I clicked on something and no. Okay, great. So here we have the syntax. Yeah, looks pretty straightforward. You have a request, you have some lambda function with a response. Did he say the no support? Yeah, exactly, no support for promises. Once again, you can you can wrap this with the new util function. You can do promisify, which is native to the more recent versions of Node, which is pretty cool. Then you can make this entire thing into a promise-based system. But here is what I wanted to look at. So we have the node fetch module, and so he states that it's a pro that it's the same thing as the browser's new fetch function, and that's also a con. And I'll say, yeah, the con is that that's because not everybody likes the fetch API. It's a pro and a con. Some people can't stand out the fact that in order to manipulate your response, you have to chain then to 2 times and some other quirks, but in the end, it matters of getting the job done, or whichever library you prefer, which is okay. But I want to just put my 2 cents in on this, and I will say that although you may not like the way that fetch works, let's remember that this is like the native, like it's something that this is the web standard. It's becoming the standard, and I argue that the best thing for you, especially if you're just learning all this stuff, like try to avoid, like, you may have heard me talk previously about the importance of making good decisions based on where the trends in the IT world are moving, because you don't want to find yourself using this obscure little library that loses support, or like does something that's not compatible, or like it gets discontinued. Like, remember that every time you're adding something to your tech stack, you're making an investment, and those investments do matter in the long run. Like, I would even go as far as to say that a fairly large amount of people around the world and really large companies have been really burned by bad tech investments. And that's basically when they have some so-called expert come in and like they add their own favorite tools to the stack, and then it turns out that, hey, they didn't do any research, they didn't know the community that well, and they basically put the company in a position where, like, let's say that you used these other tools, let's say that you used request or whatever it was, all across your, I mean, if let's say that you have an integration platform and you have like 100 instances of this function and it's being called, and then it has a logic chain and you have all this stuff, and then then somebody comes along and says, hey, we're going to discontinue support for this. And what the response that most big companies, in my experience, have is that, oh, okay, we'll just stay on the version that we've been using so far. And what happens is that that company then grows and they keep on using it over and over and over, and then time goes along and something comes along that their developers want to use or they need to use in order to leverage some new cool functionality. They want to start supporting things that this library can't help them with, and then they're fucked. Pretty much. They're fucked. Like, royally fucked. Ticketmaster that I've been working for a while are in that exact position. They made investment, like they had a tech solution. They used a certain way of writing code for a specific library, a fairly big one, but still they did it in a way that was discontinued. And because the attitude is that no, we're not gonna invest in making sure that our tools are up to date and that our coding practices are up to date and like make sure that we're pretty relevant code wise all the time, they're in they were in a position where like they could simply they had to make, like, the cost of doing that migration is enormous. And let's not forget that there is a really big benefit in keeping up to date with your tools and your practices and making sure that you're trying to figure out what tools are going to be relevant for the longest. And what I'm going to go out and say is that Node Fetch is the safest bet of these things that he's showing in this article. There's one more, the Axios module, which seems to be like, since it has question mark for cons, I'm assuming that this is his favorite and he's putting it at last. Let's see if the conclusion says anything. The same result. Yeah, my rule of thumb is to pick the smallest library with the fewest dependencies possible based on what I want to do. This guy is like, we will get along swimmingly, him and me. We see completely eye to eye on this. Like, you want to have as few dependencies as possible, and you want them to be really small and as well supported as humanly possible, because that's what's gonna keep your projects healthy for the longest. But let's get back to what I was saying. This API, this fetch API, regardless of how you feel about it, it is the web standard, and if it's the web standard, that should give you like an indicators that this is going to be well supported for a long time. So it's a safe bet. And I will say that this idea that, oh, you don't like the way it feels, well, most people are going to talk about, oh yeah, you have this fetch and then you get a response, and then in 99.99999% of all the time you need to do a response.json because you're going to want JSON. But look at the way he's writing this. This is, to me, butt ugly code. It proves my point where I say, like, you have these developers who they spend they're so caught up in the way that the APIs and the frameworks and like all this stuff works, so that they forget like how you can solve this yourself. Like, this is not a problem to me. If you wanted to make this a nice development experience, and let's just try to, I'll simulate just a scenario in my head and see if it makes sense to you guys. So I'm this developer and I'm gonna make a tech decision as fundamental as how does my application do HTTP requests. Let's just be honest, this is a major decision. It's a really important decision. If you make this arbitrarily, it's gonna fuck over your entire project, because HTTP, it's a fundamental building block. It's like a cornerstone in most applications to how do you interact with external resources. So this is not a trivial decision. And somebody says, yeah, no, we don't want to use fetch because I don't like the way this looks. So let's go with like something else that somebody else made, and maybe and that decision is going to be based on just the way that this syntax looks. And as a counterweight to that argument, I'm going to put forward and say, hey, maybe instead of getting a completely different framework, which might, break this other rule, fewer dependencies and like long-term support being the most important things, maybe we should try and fix this ourselves and see if we can do something, because there's nothing stopping you from making a little function You can even call it fetch or fetch with JSON. Just make a function that does this overhead. If you call this fetch with JSON and put this code inside of it, and all it does is it returns this response.json, you see that he's nesting this again. So response.json then, and then he gets the JSON. All you had to do was to strip all of that stuff out and do a return here. Done. And that would be, and you put the function and you do a return on the fetch. Done. This entire overhead would be gone immediately. And this so-called problem that he's mentioning here, this because not everybody likes the fetch API, yeah, that's great. Do you see my point? You solved with such a small thing the core reason why people don't like this, which is, once again, this is the standard, or rather this is becoming the standard. This is the thing that's going to be the safest bet for you long term. You don't, and some people will say, oh, I don't want it because I don't like the interface. It's just wow, just wow. It's the term used for what I'm suggesting here is basically the decorator pattern. So you create a wrapper around a piece of ugly code to make it nicer for the people who want to use it. Be careful, you don't want to throw it at everything, but this is to me a very clear situation where you would want to use that, and especially if the decision is, hey, let's go with this framework that we have no idea if it's going to be around in 5 months or not, to do something that is so important for our application, and we're going to need to be doing a lot for years and years and years. Let's do that because we don't like the way that the standard way and the safe bet looks. Yeah. So that's my little rant about how some people get bogged down in the smallest little dumb details and make bad decisions because, once again, they're being emotional and they're not thinking straight.